Ladies and gentlemen,
Good evening.
Are you ready?
Okay, here we go.
You're listening to the Deal Room Podcast. Join us as we bring you the inside scoop on business sales and acquisitions. Get across trends in the area and hear the industry's best recount their real-life tips, traps, and experiences. Now, here's your host, Joanna Oakey.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here, and welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now, today we have back on the show a guest that we've had here in the past, Nigel Hall from Bonza Business and Franchise Sales. Now, Nigel, in addition to being director of Bonza Business and Franchise Sales, is also a serial entrepreneur who has himself been involved in 4 exits and 22 transactions. He's an angel investor in multiple early stage biotech, nanotech, and IT businesses, and the perfect person to be talking to us right now on the current market trends. So in this episode, we dig into what's happening right now in business sales and acquisitions. We get an update on the industry. We get a bit of an update on trends that are happening at the moment. We talk a little bit about financing, and we also talk about approaches that buyers can use when they are dealing with financiers. So this episode has got a little bit for everyone in it. So I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. Let's get started with Nigel. Nigel, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to you for coming onto the show today.
Thank you for inviting me, Joanne. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Oh, always a pleasure to see you, Nigel. Now, today we're talking about market trends. I know you guys really have your ear to the ground. I'm always interested in hearing a market trend update. I know our listeners are as well. So why don't you give us a bit of a synopsis of what you're seeing in the market at the moment?
Yeah, so with the recent rate rises, we did expect this quarter to be a little bit slower. However, what we've seen is a record number from volume and from value in transactions completed. And partly that is a carryover from the period November to January where people were very, very on the market. There has been a little bit of a slowdown, a little bit more caution from buyers, mainly because I think the banks, the big 4 banks, very want to provide finance. However, we've been able to counter that to some extent by working with alternative finance providers and better preparing our clients for when they go to the bank. Because what we've found is if you go to the bank and just go and say, oh, I need to borrow money to buy a business, they're going to say, well, no, sorry. If you go to them and you've prepared what your asset register looks like, what the business cash flow looks like, and have a projection of how you're going to repay that loan, then your chances of getting finance are much better because the bank at the end of the day does want to lend money, but they want it repaid. And if you can show them how you're going to repay it and how you're going to secure the money for them, that's going to help you get the finance. So we work with our clients, buyers, actively on doing that to make sure that they are prepared.
I mean, that's such a sensible approach because I've certainly seen in the market lots of issues with financing generally, and of course a deal can't. You might have a very willing seller, a very willing buyer, but if the buyer hasn't got the cash and then can't get the cash, you've obviously got a massive problem with the deal. So obviously it makes absolute sense that you have an approach that you use with your buyers in order to help them to understand what to do when they are applying for finance. What are some of the things that you've, like, can you share some stories for us of like the horror stories when it's not done well versus what it looks like to do to apply for finance in the best possible way, and what buyers in that situation have done differently to those horror stories?
I think horror stories, we see deals where 2 parties have negotiated. The buyer thinks he's got finance because he's got a good relationship with his banks, but he hasn't actually asked them yet. And because of the cash flow of the business, he believes they'll lend against the business. Whereas what we quite often find is the banks go, we don't lend against the business, we'll lend against your assets. And he goes, well, I'm not asset rich because I'm putting maybe $1 million into this business, and I need to lend $1 million to be able to buy it. But then it's going to have $400,000-500,000 a year, which is going to enable them to repay it. So they're the nightmare scenarios where both parties think everything's tracking and they think it's going to be easy to get the finance, and they've just assumed they will. That's the nightmare. On the reverse side, if people are prepared to really look at what their asset base is and be sensible about what they're buying and look at what they can get and get a pre-approval, and we'd also suggest working with a good finance broker who's got access to alternative sources. That can save them a lot of pain and also give them a lot more options, because there's not just the big four banks out there, there's multiple second tier banks and non-finance or non-bank sources for finance who do provide a transactional based finance that does enable deals to get done. And quite often, if you can do a deal where you can earn a good amount of money at it but pay the loan back over 5 years, after 5 years you've got an asset that's a saleable business that you've paid off. And that is also very attractive, and a lot of people seem to forget that in their return calculations, because even if they pay a 4 times multiple and they've repaid the business after 5 years, they're looking very, very good.
Very good with this asset just sitting there, I know, right? And that's the exciting thing about this space, Nigel. That's why I love this area. There's just so much opportunity in it for our buyers. And one of the things, I guess, talking about that, the issue with buyers wanting 100% finance and then mixing it against market trends, I've seen this sort of surge in the market in the last 6 months, in the last 12 months, but particularly the last 6 months, from these no money down buyers, which sometimes, can happen. Sometimes you can have clever deal structuring. Sometimes that can work. Sometimes you can get a heap of finance and make that work. But it's an interesting buyer market that I'm seeing in this no money down market at the moment, where in my experience, 90% of them don't end up going anywhere because they have, they've done a course somewhere and they have a completely unrealistic expectation of what they're actually going to be able to do in the market, which creates a whole lot of wasted time, in my perception, and in quite a few deals that I've seen with that sort of exposure. What are you seeing in the market? What's your thoughts about all of this?
First of all, the zero money in buyer is not one of our favourites, obviously. And the reason for that is, I've been working in startup space and business transactions for 30 odd years. And if someone hasn't managed to put enough aside to put a deposit on a business or to put money into a startup business, they probably haven't got the experience or the financial know-how to operate that business afterwards. So they're probably not doing the seller a favour by doing that type of transaction. They're not doing themselves a favour because they're setting themselves up for failure. Debt kills businesses. If it's over leveraged, it will kill the business. So we're not a fan of that. If they've got other assets and the bank is prepared to lend against that, then the seller can de-risk themselves by taking, we'd always suggest at least 50%, if not 70% of the payment up front, and have a structure in place where they do take vendor financing or vendor support, deferred payments, etc. on the remaining portion. However, from a vendor point of view, they also want to look at it as if they were a bank and say, how am I going to get repaid? So we'd work with the buyer and the seller to say, this is how the buyer intends to repay this. Let's make sure we structure the deal in such a way that they can see it is going to be repaid over a maximum period of 2 years with X amount of payment per quarter. And if it doesn't happen, this is the consequence. And that's really very important, I think, in vendor finance. It's not to enter into it lightly. It is riskier. However, in the US, about 50% of deals are done on vendor finance. It does mean that businesses get sold at a higher value because they're factoring that into the value of the business. However, most of that vendor financing gets paid off because if the person selling is confident in the performance of their business and they've checked the buyer the way we check a buyer to see whether they've got the skill set to run the business, whether they've got the right motivation and the right headspace and the skill set, then that vendor financing will pay out. Yeah, we're seeing an increased demand for vendor financing or deferred payments or retentions, all three different structures. And it is important that the vendor understands and the buyer understands it is actually almost a loan in many cases if it's true vendor financing, and that the approach has to be understand the risk you're taking, understand the buyer, understand their asset base, and understand what the consequences are of non-repayment for both parties.
Yeah, I totally agree. And look, in our deal sizes of sort of that 3-4 million up, we see almost all deals will have, not all, but a really high percentage will have a deal structure component, a deferred payment component in some way, shape or form. And I do see this flowing through the whole market now. It's interesting that you talk about the US. You said 50% of deals are done on vendor finance. And I think it certainly is a real opportunity. It's an opportunity, obviously, for sellers to reach a larger buyer pool, if they're open to that sort of opportunity, I guess. But as you say, there's absolutely a potential risk there, and it's about buyers understanding that there's this trade-off as well, and for them to understand that if they're coming in with vendor finance as something that they're looking for, then they need to make sure, number one, that they can prove their ability to repay, because that becomes a real concern for sellers, as it should be. How do we make sure we've secured these future payments? But also to make sure it's clear that there's a bit of upside for the seller in taking on a bit of that risk. So it's about making sure our buyers come in understanding that this is, a benefit to them, and they need to work out how they're properly, selling the benefit that they're going to provide to a seller.
I think also, obviously, it's part of the risk management for a buyer, because it does enable them to see the performance of the business going forward. And coming out of the COVID years where we've seen very unusual trading patterns, some businesses have suffered badly, particularly the Victorian businesses. Other businesses performed extremely well. A lot of Queensland, New South Wales construction side. And they've had above normal profitability. And now if they look to sell this year and they're coming out of that above normal, are they going to maintain it? And you can understand the buyers then looking at this and going, you've had 2 good years, but is that COVID driven? Let's have a look and let's put something in place that does give me that downside protection if the performance isn't maintained. And that is totally understandable. And I think it's totally reasonable as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. Look, some really clever approaches there. Have we missed anything in market trends? Anything else you're seeing that you feel the need to call out?
I think, importantly, we do a lot of appraisals for businesses because we appraise most businesses before we take them to market. Some people just want to go to market, but we appraise free of charge as well. And we see a lot of businesses, and what we're seeing is that well-run businesses are still performing well. There hasn't been a dip in the market from a business performance point of view. Businesses that are struggling at the moment were struggling prior to COVID. They may have done a lot better because they were getting a lot of JobKeeper, but they're struggling again now. So good businesses perform well generally in good markets, and the market isn't bad. The market isn't bad, and the sales market, our volumes are above where they've ever been. So very happy. It's
fascinating, isn't it? Because there has been a lot of talk coming into 2023 about the likelihood of a huge deluge of distressed businesses on the market. Just interesting to hear your feedback here that actually that's not what you're seeing as this massive trend coming through at the moment. But maybe it just won't be, maybe. And I guess the flip side as well is I do see that there still is a bit of exhaustion in sellers. So it doesn't have to just be distressed businesses, but I guess out of the sort of last few years that we've had, I think there are a lot of business owners who are exhausted. So, obviously
different state to state. Queensland really didn't suffer much from COVID.
Yes.
And Queensland's been a great market. New South Wales suffered a little bit, but not as much as Victoria. Victoria, I think, is still a little bit in the doldrums. Yeah. And they had a tough time. They had 2 years of lockdowns. Most lockdown city in the world was Melbourne, so it's understandable that people are well, I just don't feel like I've got the energy to take another project on at the moment.
Yeah. And as you say, completely understandable and fascinating that we have this really, this large difference between states, and some being more buoyant and still the others, like the Victorian market, still feeling the pull of those last couple of hard years. Well, look, Nigel, I just want to say a huge thank you for coming onto the show today. If our listeners are interested in maybe finding out how you guys can help with selling a business, we have lots of accountants as well who are listening in. If they need assistance with their clients, how do they go about getting in contact with your team?
Well, obviously, our website is the first one, which we'll put in the links. 1300 266 922, and we pick the phone up in normal working hours, and we'll always call you back if you can't get hold of us, or go onto our website and book a call, or send us an SMS off our website.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, look, wonderful. Thanks, Nigel. Of course, we'll put all of those links into our show notes. So if you are running along the beach or in your commute to or from work at the moment, have no fear. You can just click into the show notes afterwards. Goodness me, don't have an accident trying to write this down as you're driving. Click into your show notes and you'll be able to get straight through to Nigel and the team there. Look, Nigel, I just wanted to say a huge thank you for coming onto the podcast today.
Thank you for the invite again, Joe.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Deal Room podcast. We hope you're now primed for your next deal with these pointers and have enjoyed these fascinating insights. Now, if you'd like more information about this topic, then head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com, where you'll be able to download a transcript of this episode, as well as access any contact details and any other additional information we referred to in today's podcast. Now, if you'd like to get in contact with our guests today and the services they offer, you can go ahead and check out our show notes for a link right through to them and their details. You can also book in directly with our legals at Aspect Legal if you'd like to soundboard your next steps, discuss a legal question, or find out more how we can assist, whether that's with buying or selling a business, or perhaps somewhere in between. Now, don't forget to subscribe to the Deal Room podcast on your favourite podcast player to get notifications whenever a new episode is out. We'd also love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review and rating if you're already one of our subscribers, or even if you're listening to this podcast for the very first time. Every review helps our team produce valuable content for you. Well, thanks again for listening in. You've been listening to Joanna Oakey and the Deal Room podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. I am so very excited to announce that I've hit a non-podcast related milestone and released a book. You might wonder why? Simple. I wanted to help business owners understand the mechanics of deal making and the interaction between three critical phases of business: acquisition, growth, and exit. And so I am very happy to announce Buy, Grow, Exit, a guidebook for business owners and their advisors on how to buy, grow, and guess what, exit in a way that maximizes value and avoids landmines along the way. The book is available now, so just head over to buygrowexit.com.au to get your copy and to access a whole heap of free resources that will really help you on your journey of acquisition, growth, and exit in your business or in working with your clients. Also, check out our show notes where we will link straight through to that page.
Ladies and gentlemen.
That will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Thanks for listening to the Deal Room podcast. To find out more about this episode and other episodes in the series, check out the show notes or head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com.au.